So just welcoming everyone. I see we have about 43 people now on the call. So just inviting you to, as we're just getting ready to start, to just enter your name, your organisation, where you're Zooming from, and what the weather's like where you are, just to get us started. We're going to get underway now in a moment. So great to see Limerick, Beachmount, Lisburn. So great to see Bernardo's colleagues on, Jacinta and Nuri. So great to see our colleagues at the University of Limerick on board. Hi, Conal from Parenting NI. Lovely to see you here this afternoon. So just while we're letting everyone get settled and we're just about to start, can I ask you just to mute yourselves? Hello to the colleagues from Alberta. Great to see you here. Great to see colleagues from Mencap. Just while you're gathering and getting settled, just inviting you to say who you are, where you're from, and what the weather's like where you are. And great to see Tom joining us. Hi, Andy. So I'm going to invite Katrina to get us going by sharing just a little video about today's event. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Magella McCluskey, and I work at the Centre for Effective Services. This afternoon, we're bringing together a programme for you that's going to focus on how we implement services in order to really deliver outcomes for families and communities. And we're particularly focusing today on the power of trusted relationships. The work that we're featuring today comes as the result of a 7-year partnership with a number of organisations across Northern Ireland who deliver family support services. And all of this has been enabled by the resourcing and the partnership of the National Lottery Community Fund. And you're going to hear more from both the National Lottery and one of the grant holders in a little while. We're also very, very delighted to be joined by a long-standing associate and partner that we really highly regard and love working with, Allison Metz. And Allison, you're going to be introduced to formally later today, but she has worked extensively with the statutory and the voluntary sector in Northern Ireland throughout my time at CES, and we're delighted that she's here again today. So let me tell you just a little bit about our work and implementation before I hand over to my colleague Katie. So over the course of our time at CES, we've discovered that whilst people often think about what they want to do, the difference that they want to make, whether they want to tackle youth crime, give children a better start in life, they may often have programs that they want to implement or see delivered. Often less attention is paid to how the work is done, how the programme is going to be delivered. And I suppose we've made it a bit of a life's work in CES to pay attention to that, because we think that makes the critical difference in delivering outcomes for families, communities, children, older people, and really makes a difference in delivering outcomes in Northern Ireland. So we've spent 7 years delivering support to grant holders on this programme, but we have a wide range of work supporting implementation with the statutory sector in local communities, with the voluntary and community sector. And we're delighted that this body of work that we've developed with the grant holders and with the National Lottery is going to be carried forward into new programmes of work that we're going to be doing on implementation. For example, we've just established a new partnership with Queen's University and University of Limerick to support the creation of an evidence hub for policymakers, and CES is going to be bringing an implementation lens to that work. So delighted to be with you this afternoon, grateful for the partnership that has made today possible, and I'm very, very pleased to hand over to my colleague Katie Burke, who's going to be moderating today's event for you. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Magella. And good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be with you all this afternoon. When we were thinking about this webinar, and there were a number of us involved in it, and a number of conversations between the National Lottery, the Reaching Out Supporting Families programme, and some of us in CES, we thought that we wanted to try and have it as a conversation. So we want the tone this afternoon to be conversational, and there will be inputs, fantastic inputs, by the way, no pressure on the speakers, but I didn't mean to put pressure on the speakers, but there will be a number of inputs from some really great speakers. But we have asked them to not think of it as a formal presentation, but to think of it as a contribution to a 2 hour, little bit less than 2 hours conversation. So with that in mind, I have my mug of tea here. So I'm encouraging you all to think about this as a really good cup of tea, a serious cup of tea. Like, we can all have serious conversations over cups of tea. So I'm not suggesting this is a hilarious 2 hours. It's a serious cup of tea, but we hope that you leave at 5 o'clock this evening, if you're watching on the island of Ireland, at whatever time, depending on wherever you're watching from, but you leave feeling invigorated and stimulated and with some new thoughts for your work, maybe even for life. So the other thing I want to say is that it is an organised cup of tea. So just in case you think you're going to have the chaotic cup of tea, no, it's the organised cup of tea. So the order of, so as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have 4 inputs, and then we're keeping almost a half hour for discussion, okay? Because we often, as is often the case, some of the richest kind of insights can come out when you have the conversation and the opportunity to ask questions. So we're going to kick off in a couple of minutes with Paul Sweeney, who we're delighted to have with us this afternoon. Paul is chair of the National Lottery Community Fund, Northern Ireland Committee. Then the second input will be from my colleague Melanie Stone, who I'm sure many of you will know, and she is going to speak to us about what has been learned about effective implementation of early intervention family support services through the Reaching Out Supporting Families programme. The third input will be from Dr. Allison Metz at the School of Social Work at the University of North Carolina, who has a particular research interest in this whole area of power, relationships, implementation in child and family services. And then the fourth input will be from Jacinta Lindon, who's founder and CEO of Bolster Community. And they are a social enterprise based in Newry, but with services broader than that, I understand. Sure, Jacinta will keep me straight on that. And a grantee of the Reaching Out Supporting Families programme. And then the last 25 minutes, we're going to hold for questions or observations and comments. So I'm going to encourage you, as we go, feel free to put a question or a comment in the chat. And I'm going to prompt you about that at the end of the presentations, but you can put them in now and we'll keep an eye on them, and I'll come back to how we'll manage that in a few minutes. So just be thinking about comments and questions as you hear the inputs. And so that we keep the time for the discussion, I have, with the permission of the speakers, I have their permission that 2 minutes before they're due to finish, I'm going to make a little gentle intervention to remind them that they have 2 minutes to finish, okay? Because I know we can all get very enthusiastic. And they are going to be great. So the risk here is that there's loads to hear and we don't have the risk for the time for the discussion. So I'm going to give you speakers, remember that, a little gentle intervention, 2 minutes from the end, and that'll encourage you to finish up. So Paul Sweeney is going to set the scene for us. Paul is today representing the National Lottery Community Fund, Northern Ireland Committee, but actually he brings a wealth of experience in the voluntary community and public sectors in Northern Ireland. He retired from the Northern Irish Civil Service in 2017, and he served in a number of senior roles there, a number of pretty serious senior roles there, including as Deputy Secretary in the Office of the First Minister, Deputy First Minister, and as Permanent Secretary in 2 government departments, the Department for Culture, Arts and Leisure, and finally in the Department of Education. So Paul, you're most welcome. I'll hand over to you.
Katie, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone from sunny North Belfast. I'm in the shadow of Napoleon's Nose on the Cave Hill, and Alison, if I was in Toppling, Napoleon's Nose now, I could almost see Washington, so it's a very, very small world. So there you go. I want to thank Melanie and her colleagues at CES for organising this very important webinar, focusing as it is on the power of trusted relationships in implementation. As a board member of the National Lottery Community Fund and chair of the Northern Ireland Committee, I welcome this opportunity to make some introductory remarks. I'm joined this afternoon by Nuala Macaulay and Eileen Jack, who are members of the National Lottery Community Fund staff in Belfast. The Reaching Out Supporting Families represents a long-term investment of £25 million by the fund and has been able to support 36 projects working over a period of 5 years. This funding, of course, has been made possible by the National Lottery players and has empowered hundreds of families to challenge and overcome adversities by providing bespoke family support services. Crucially, the family support services have been shaped and developed by families and the projects in collaboration with project promoters and project partners who have all engaged together in trustful relationships to achieve the best possible outcomes. An important feature of the programme has been opportunities for the projects and families to engage with each other, to listen and learn from each other, and to focus on what works and explore new approaches. Over and above the initial £25 million investment by the Community Fund, we have been able to make some additional funding available to some of the projects through a competitive process for a 2-year extension. And this has enabled those supported projects to develop new aspects of their approach, such as piloting sustainability models or putting evaluation findings into practice. Today's webinar is bringing together a range of stakeholders to share their expertise and experiences of the power of trusted relationships. The ethos of the National Lottery Community Fund is based on a commitment to building trusted relationships through our grant making. In the case of this programme, we have developed trusted relationships with CES, the various projects, and the families actively engaged with the projects. The projects in turn have developed an impressive network of trusted relationships with partner organisations, both in the statutory and voluntary sectors. From my professional and personal life experience, trusted relationships are based on the following: respecting and valuing each other, taking responsibility and being accountable, being very candid with each other, and being prepared to initiate those difficult and at times challenging conversations when the need arises. Developing common goals and striving to make that positive difference, and working every day to build resilience, knowing that nothing runs smooth in life, nothing runs smooth in relationships, but a strong belief that we will find a way. Together we will get through this. In terms of resilience and responsiveness to local need, I have been so impressed how community-based projects have responded to the unprecedented challenges of COVID-19. The statutory, the voluntary and community sectors came together in a spirit of trusted relationships and responded so admirably to addressing local need. As the Reaching Out Supporting Families programme now draws to a close, I want to say that the National Lottery Community Fund is proud of the part that we've been able to play in the success of this programme. And we have been so impressed by the real positive impact that the participating projects have had in the lives of hundreds of families. We greatly value the trusted relationships we have nurtured with all the participants in the programme, and not least the role played by CES in the insightful and meaningful way in which they have overseen the implementation of the programme. Finally, for me, looking to the future, just this week, the National Lottery Community Fund across the UK has embarked upon a listening exercise, a strategy renewal process to ensure that our policies and programmes and grant making remain relevant to those communities most in need, and those communities that are now confronted by a multitude of additional challenges just coming out of COVID-19. And here in Northern Ireland, we want to listen and to garner people's ideas and suggestions as to how we might shape the future of our grant-making role over the next several years. So can I ask participants this afternoon, when you do get an opportunity in the weeks ahead, please engage with us in the National Lottery Community Fund. We'd love to hear your ideas and insights as to how we can develop our grant-making portfolio, as I say, over the next several years, and how best can we remain relevant and responsive to local needs. And in terms of engaging, you'll find all the details on the National Lottery Community Fund NI website. So finally, well done again to CES for organising this afternoon's webinar. Well done to all those projects that continue to make a real positive difference to the lives of families right across all our community. And thank you, and I wish you well for the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Paul. That was a great kickoff and a scene-setting piece for us. And I was scribbling furiously, so you can tell me if I got this right. I thought you named really, really nicely what constitutes for you a trusted relationships. You said in both the professional and a personal term. So I'm going to risk it here now, and you can tell me if I've got this right. I had 5 bits. I think it sets the scene really nicely for our webinar today. I haven't got all the words. Trusted relationships, I think you said, are about respect and valuing each other, firstly. Secondly, about taking responsibility and being accountable. I really like that. Thirdly, about being candid with each other and willing to have the challenging conversations when needed. Fourthly, that people are working together towards common goals. And fifthly, the resilience piece. Trusted relationships help to build resilience. Did I get that broadly right?
Absolutely, very impressed.
Oh, well, I just thought I did scribble them. I think they set the scene really well for today. So So folks, I'm going to encourage you to hold some of those in your heads as we go through the rest of the afternoon. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
So I'm going to now move on to Melanie Stone, who's a project specialist at CES. And Mel has a wealth of experience as a practitioner, social worker by heart. And she's knee-deep in both family support services and implementation science. She has very ably led CES's work on the Reaching Out Supporting Families work over the last 7 years. And she has loved that, I know, from many conversations I've had with her over that time. So over to you, Mel.
Oh, thank you so much, Katie. Yes, absolutely. Loved every minute of it. Good afternoon, everyone. And as Katie says, I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here talking about the learning from the Reaching Out Supporting Families programme, and especially what it took to make these projects work. So over the last 7 years, CES has had a role in both supporting implementation of the projects and capturing the learning on what has supported and hindered their successful implementation. If you're wondering what implementation is as a field of study, a very simple explanation might be that the study of implementation is the study of how we do things well. So in this case, how we turn a good service design into good outcomes for families. We know from implementation research that just having an effective service design or an effective programme doesn't mean that things will change for families. Success is equally dependent on how those services are implemented. Now, we have a CES guide to implementation that we'll share in the chat. I'm always happy to talk to anybody who's interested in finding out more about that. So to give you some background on CES's contribution to the implementation of the programme, our input was delivered through an annual calendar of training and networking meetings and project visits to address specific challenges. In the early stages, we talked about some of the processes that might support good implementation around planning and governance, policies and procedures, training and supervision of staff, leadership, data collection. We focused on partnership working, the creation and maintenance of shared vision, as Paul referred to, amongst partners, as well as the mechanics of collaboration, such as roles and responsibilities, shared planning and problem solving. We emphasised the move towards outcomes-focused reporting with extensive training covering the development of a theory of change for the work, collecting and analysing outcomes-focused data, and then telling the story of the successes and the learning of the projects. And then finally, we discussed how the grant holding organisations were creating the conditions for change and adapting their services as they learned more about the needs of their families. So now in year 7 of reflecting on implementation, our discussions are more informed and mature as the projects are clearer about what has enabled and hindered the achievement of their outcomes. And across the years, these enablers and barriers, as we call them, have been internal and external factors. Some barriers were controllable once they were recognised, and some were not. Power differentials, lack of funding, and short funding cycles are not easily influenced for any of us. When we started the process of coding and analysing a substantial amount of data collected about implementation, there were a few strong themes that emerged. I'll just briefly mention 3 of them. Firstly, to be anticipated, staffing. Recruitment and retention of good staff members was significant in implementation. Funding the training of new staff was a challenge, as was maintaining continuity when there was staff turnover. And then staff supervision, so good quality staff supervision was recognised as an enabler, and conversely, lack of good quality supervision made some staff feel at risk, and that potentially reduced staff retention. And then the second one was engagement methods, which came out strongly. And the methods of engagement across the programme were so diverse, and there is such a lot of learning about how to engage with families who don't come looking for help or who would be reluctant to engage with services. It was tremendously impressive. And then finally, flexibility and accessibility of services and project staff was perceived as a significant factor in the success of the programme. So these are all things that I could talk about extensively today. All themes the projects told us were important. However, the standout themes of this whole programme are trust and relationships. We saw it in our work on what good family support looks like. We saw it when we developed the learning paper on partnership working, and we see it again in studying the programme implementation. At the same time as we have seen this theme emerging, the field of implementation science has seen a shift in focus towards the role of trust and relationships in supporting the implementation of human services. And so I am absolutely delighted to have Allison Metz here today to speak to us more about that. So we saw this interesting coming together of the research field and our own evidence from the programme, and got to thinking about what that really tells us. There were 4 parties involved in making this programme a success: the families, who both benefited from and shaped it; the projects, including grant holding organisations and the partner organisations; and then CES as the implementation support organisation, and the National Lottery Community Fund that made it all possible. When we considered the relationship between these 4 parties, we saw that they were characterised by similar traits. And I'm just going to share a little slide with you here. So we saw that the relationships and the connections between these 4 parties were characterised by very similar traits. And what we found was that they were being available and accessible, listening and adapting, developing a shared understanding of the challenges and opportunities that existed, having a flexible approach to delivering what was intended, enabling the other party to bring their expertise to the work, and investing time and resources in intentional relationship building. Those were 6 strong themes that came out of all of the data that we analysed. These together produced trust and relationships that really became the hallmark of the Reaching Out Supporting Families programme, and they also addressed issues of equity and power between the different parties. So one of my favourite questions to ask is, what does that look like in reality? And I think Allison Metz has previously phrased it as, what does it look like at the level of saying and doing? So I hope you can see all of it. So in respect of the National Lottery Community Fund's relationship with us and the projects, there were 4 key characteristics that stood out in their relationship with CES and their relationship with the 36 projects. The team provided a key contact who met with us regularly and was available at other times. The team started with the agreed plan, but took time to hear what was being learned about the effectiveness of the original service design and delivery, and what adaptations were then required. They were clear that they wanted whatever was going to be best for the families. That was the #1 priority. And they believed in the expertise of the projects and CES. In fact, they believed in the large national organisations and also the small community groups that had never been funded to do their work before. And the expertise of both was valued and appreciated, and there was a real equity in that. When CES started working with the projects, they were under no obligation to engage with us. So we had to build trust and make sure the support we were offering was what they wanted. We set about making ourselves available, accessible, and very easy to work with. We invited people to meet together. We served up a lot of tea and scones, and we chatted a lot about their work, what was going well, what the challenges were. In the beginning, people found it hard to anticipate their learning needs. So it was this listening and chatting that led us to identify common themes that were coming up that we then built into the learning programme. And that took time. So we've had a lot of feedback to suggest that this curiosity and non-judgmental tone enabled honest conversations about the struggles of doing this sort of early intervention work. The projects who engaged knew we were for them and felt supported. And I know they felt the same way about the National Lottery Community Fund. It was through creating this culture that we were then able to provide more specific support when difficulties arose, either in the work, the partnership, or at an organisational level. So this intentional building of trusted relationships also led to organisations bringing into the group their expertise of what was working and what was tried and didn't work, and knowledge of useful resources. And that is no mean feat, because they were competing for limited funds in the voluntary and community sector. Then moving on to the projects, the imagination and tenacity they demonstrated in engaging and building relationships with families is to be commended. And with COVID, they have gone above and beyond to engage in new ways and maintain those relationships. Many reflected that you don't just get the funding, open the service, and then people start to come through the door asking for help. You have to earn their trust, and that takes time. They developed activities that provided an entry point for families who might come under that awful heading of hard to reach, such as family fun days, Zumba, baby massage, baby cafe, siblings groups, and that's to name a very few. Staff spent time at the school gate, providing drop-in sessions in schools, being visible in the community, even knocking on doors with leaflets. One addressed the decor of the building to make it attractive to father figures. Another facilitated parents not ready to talk about their experiences of trauma to just lunch together for social connection for as long as they needed to before they were ready to talk. And some provided alternative therapies. And all of these were designed to make it possible for the families on the margins to come in and get the support they needed, and to come together with others with similar experiences and to build trusting relationships. And then the outcomes data indicates that this reduced social isolation, built confidence, and led to quality of life improvements for families. So I have a great quote from one project here, and it says, so people would have seen us out and about, and I remember, like, it was a health visitor from one of the Sure Starts years ago. She used to crack up and say, our boss has a policy that we walk. I was like, that's fantastic, because you have such a presence then in the community. The investment in building relationships with families over time then also led to the development, or in some cases, the strengthening of parental involvement in co-designing service improvements or service redesign. In this respect, the families were indeed co-actors in the successful implementation of the Reaching Out Supporting Families programme, and that's not to be underestimated. They also were instrumental in enabling other parents to trust the services. So some parents became volunteers, mentors, ambassadors, steering group members, and even board members. In terms of effective implementation and its reliance on trusted relationship, projects invested time in their partners and in new informal partners to create a community infrastructure of support for families. And this is a quote from a rural community development project. It says, the staff know how to engage on the ground, building your community networks. It's all there, we have it. We know who to lift the phone to and say, look, something's happening in Derrymore, could you go? And it's all there, that's half the battle. I thought going into this process, I had a lot of contacts. Now I have hundreds. And then another empowerment project that worked with families from minority ethnic groups spoke about having to break down barriers and build relationships with the organisations trusted by those families in order to get the information about their service out to them. And they said, so we had to break down some barriers, and it's just about, convincing them, building up trust with centres that you're not there to do any damage to them. You're not there to take anything away from them. You're there to give. But again, it took a while for them to believe it too. So what role they provided was, once they accepted us in the community, then they're able to introduce us to groups or just say, look, these guys have this programme, you might be interested, come and listen to them. So getting people into the room, listen to us. Then you get to that stage where we could deliver. Like with the Syrian women, just before we got there, by saying, these people are not here working with the police or anything. So announcing our presence, I suppose, in a trusted way, because people do trust in local communities and they do trust local community centres. So if they trust us, then they're going to listen to us. A great quote. I think these three quotes demonstrate how critical the development, the intentional development of trusted relationships was to the effective implementation of their projects. We know that good service design is important, as is a trained, well-supported and resourced staff team, supportive organisational structures and adaptive leadership. But in the Reaching Out Supporting Families programme, the data coming from our Capturing the Learning work tells us that the secret sauce is trusted relationships. So I'm just going to finish by returning to the list of characteristics of trusted relationships, which are not restricted to this programme. we've already had conversations in CES with colleagues doing work in other sectors, and there's such strong resonance with these themes. So I would advocate building in the time to develop these 6 building blocks, because we have seen that it leads to successful implementation and better outcomes for families. Finally, I just want to acknowledge and sincerely thank, honestly, the projects for their generosity in sharing their expertise with each other and with us over the last 7 years, and allowing us to learn from them. What went well and what didn't. Sharing failures is a really brave thing to do, and the projects did that so that we could learn. It has been an absolute joy from start to finish, and I thank the National Lottery Community Fund for making it possible. Thank you, Katie.
Katie had to unmute. Thank you, Mel. That was a whirlwind. Okay, there was an awful lot in that, wasn't there, folks? Holy God. Now, those quotes, Mel, they're fantastic. You need to write them down somewhere. I know they're in our report, which is in the chat, but they are fantastic quotes, and people might use them somewhere. If you were to share the slides, you might even just put the 3 quotes in a slide or something for people. Would that be helpful? I bet, because it's very hard to absorb the quote when you just hear it, and they're great quotes.
I had a little script. I'll be quite happy just to share it.
Very good, very good. Well done, Mel. That was a tour de force. I'm sure there are loads of questions. I just want to I'm going to continue on this thread now that I've started it. Paul gave us what he, based on his own experience, identified as 5 components of trusted relationships. Mel has given us the 6 building blocks, she called them, I think. Am I right here, Mel? Of the trusted relationships that came from the learning captured from the Reaching Out Supporting Families. That was the slide with the 6 bubbles. Am I right? Okay, so just bear all that. They're all moving in the same direction. So well, and what's the differences? That's the other question that we might ask ourselves. So thanks, Mel. We'll come back to you with questions and comments in a little while. So our next input is Allison Metz. Allison, we're delighted to have you with us. Allison is the Professor of Practice and the Director of Implementation Practice at the School of Social Work at the University of North Carolina. So I know some of you in Northern Ireland and across the world have known Allison over a period of time, and she's always had an interest in the practice of implementation. I think that has got a little bit sharper over the last few years, probably. She'll tell us more about that. Allison is a developmental psychologist by training, and her particular area of interest is child development and family systems. You're going to hear all about what she thinks about trust, power, well, not all about, a good flavor of what she thinks about trust, power, and relationships when implementing changes or enhancements to services for children and families. I'll leave it at that. Allison, over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
And I know, sorry, I'm interrupting you now. Everybody has been so good on the timing, so just you don't need to rush. That is a very dangerous thing, I know, sometimes to say to Allison, but don't rush too much, Allison.
I won't rush too much, but I'm going to be really respectful because everyone else has been too with their time. And I'm so happy to be here, and honestly so honored to be asked to talk about this topic. It's a topic close to my heart, as it seems to be everyone's when I see the chat and how much this is really resonating with folks, and just everything Paul and Mel have already shared is resonant with me. So hopefully I'm adding on to that and keeping this conversation going. So I am going to be talking about the power of trusting relationships, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the research behind that. So what do we know about the strategies that we use to promote trust, and what are the outcomes of trusting relationships? So Mel spent some nice time talking about implementation and what it is and how we study it. And probably this concept of trust has been understudied in the field of implementation science, and I think needs a lot more attention. So again, it's wonderful to be here. So when I was invited to join you all today, I spent some time, of course, talking to folks involved and the Reaching Out Supporting Families program, but reading the learning report and really kind of taking a look at all the incredible work that's been done in the last 7 years. And there were some things that stood out to me in that report and again, felt really resonant. So I just wanted to share that before I kind of jump into some other ideas. So the report talked about trust and mutual respect and equality across the sectors as key to building effective partnerships, and that building effective relationships creates a strong foundation for innovation, problem solving, and sustainability. And you can see along the bottom one of the quotes, and it's just so beautiful, this idea about what is it that we're building together, and not always focusing on what we can get out of something, but how we can contribute and build something together. And so was thinking about these ideas as I was kind of crafting the presentation today. And what you'll see is I've kind of woven in some quotes from the learning report that I think is available for everyone. And I kind of put them in to my presentation just to kind of show that we're all kind of thinking about the same things and noticing the same things in our implementation efforts. So I wanted to start with something that has really impacted me and my work in supporting implementation over the last few years. And it's the idea of systems theory and what it is we know about systems. And a lot of folks probably on today are familiar with the systems iceberg. What I'm presenting here is very similar to that. It's called the water for systems change. And they are very similar ideas. This is just a little bit more skeletal for this slide. But one of the things that I noticed in my own career, which has gotten kind of long at this point, is that in most of our implementation efforts, we're focusing on things that are really tangible, things that we can see, things that we can measure. So that might be the number of trainings, the number of meetings, other data collection activities. But what we know is it's often what we can't see, what we can't easily measure that is really impacting implementation. And I think that's what Paul and Mel were already kind of setting us up to talk about today. So you can see in this framework that's on the slide, again, very similar to the systems iceberg, really talking about the idea that part of implementation involves structural change. So changes to our practices, increases in resources, development of policies that might enable those practices, things that are pretty explicit, things we can write down and that we can see. But there's other aspects of implementation that are less explicit. So you kind of see the row below what we refer to as kind of which are relationships and connections. Yes, we might have a sense of them. We might see them at work at times, but they're not as explicit. They're sometimes hard for us to get a handle on, as are power dynamics in the work. Some power is very explicit. I saw something in the chat about funders and the role of funders and community partners. There are other power issues that are often present in our kind of group and teamwork together in implementation that, again, maybe is not as noticeable, but we have a sense that something is happening. And the one thing we definitely can't see right away, and sometimes for a long time, unless we are attuned to it, are people's mental models. So mental models really represent what we carry with us and bring to anything we're involved in. They represent our assumptions about the work, our belief systems, the values that we hold. And those mental models, they impact everything, how we interact with each other, how we interpret information and data, the relationships we form, the decisions that we make. And one of the things that I've tried to do as I think about bringing this work into my own implementation practice is to spend a lot of time making sure that I'm staying curious. Because one thing that I know is that in doing the work, when relationships can be hard, often because we don't always share the same mental model. And that could be, what do we mean by something being community-led? What does it mean to involve parent, youth, family voice in the work? people bring values to this, and it's really important that we find ways to understand that and to represent that in the work, and to seek to find a group or a shared mental model. And I think Mel was talking about that a bit on the last slide, this idea of a shared understanding, that's getting at this idea of values and mental models. So I just wanted to talk about how that relates to trust. So this is a very short case example. You don't need to know much about it at all. But I do a lot of work in public child welfare systems here in the United States. And one of the things that we asked folks who are currently involved and still working with this group, it's in a fairly large city in the US, in the southeast of the US, it's a pretty large child welfare jurisdiction. And they are seeking to expand the preventive services that they have, so to prevent children from entering into the foster care system. They're involving a lot of partners in this work. It has a lot of federal attention. And we showed this transformational change model to them. Because we know that we can easily focus on the structural aspects. We can pick programs. We can absolutely pick evidence-based programs. Then we can focus on that. But if we want to have truly transformational change, implementation that's sustainable, implementation that is equitable, that will result in positive impacts for everyone, that we know that we need to focus on more than those structural pieces. So we asked them, what would you need to focus on the kind of bottom of that triangle, the mental models, the relationships aspect of the work, and what would hinder our ability? And I just wanted you to see, this was COVID times, so we have lots of artifacts of our work together because they're always done on Google Jamboards instead of in a real room. So I just wanted to show you a couple of these Google Jamboards so you can see what community partners and funders, different stakeholder groups, advocates put onto this Google Jamboard. What would they need to do truly transformational work? And you can start to see, build relationships, build trust. You see, there is a mention of joy. I saw that in the chat, and Mel, you mentioned it, leaving room for joy in the work. So this was really interesting. People went right for that trust and relationships, that is what was going to carry them through the work. We asked them, why won't we be able to do this together? This data is very compelling to me. It actually makes me feel kind of sad at times that there's so many implementation efforts that don't focus on this. People wrote fear of doing things differently, a lack of trust with each other, right? So rushing to make decisions. So a lot of these aspects that are part of, in some ways, a false sense of urgency that often is paired with implementation efforts and really reduces our ability to develop shared values, to build those relationships, and to lift up power differentials that are impacting the work, and in many ways, can impact the work negatively for certain stakeholder groups. So I just wanted to share that as something that I think feels really aligned with what you found in reaching out, supporting families over the last 7 years, and why you were so focused on trust building at multiple levels to be able to not only innovate, but to be able to sustain and get to those positive outcomes for families. So we know that trust is really the cornerstone of effective partnerships. And that second dot point on here, I think, is something that's really, important, because we're talking about the concept of implementation and what is implementation science, and it's the study of the how, but implementation inherently relies on collaborative learning, taking risks, and failing. Because nothing we start immediately works perfectly, right? So we're in this constant learning mode. So implementation really relies on our ability to take risks, learn together, and to see failure as opportunity rather than a disappointment. At the center of being able to do that is vulnerability and trust. So it's inherent in our work, but it's often not, again, what's made explicit. It's kind of what's deep below the surface and things that we're not often talking about. So we've been lucky enough to have philanthropic funding from a foundation in the US, the William T. Grant Foundation, over the last few years to take a very specific look at the role of trust in implementation. So strategies that build trust, that idea of how do you know that you're in a trusting relationship? What would it feel like? How would you describe it so that we can do a better job of measuring it? You know, I know this will feel, you all agree with this, you know, we know that everyone involved in implementation efforts described relationships and trust as critical, foundational, at the heart of the work. And what we found was that trust appeared to foster an environment in which change efforts were optimized and sustained. So before I talk about how we build trust, I want to focus a little bit on the outcomes of trust. So we just finished a systematic review on this, where there's actually a lot of empirical evidence about why trust would matter so much in implementation efforts. And there's also a lot of theoretical assumptions or really good theory that would provide the basis of this. And not going to get into theory today, but there's lots of theory, cultural exchange theory, relational theory, that really does offer us some really solid assumptions that we can test in the work. And again, there are research studies and really strong empirical evidence. So here, this kind of builds a bit of a theory of change for you without the graphic, meaning the dot points kind of move in the direction of getting to what's at the bottom there, improved and equitable outcomes for children and families. So we know that trust helps to change behavior. So if you think about behavioral science or things that have been talked about in the field of implementation as kind of levers that we might pull to change people's behavior, we know that people need to feel capable, they need to feel motivated, and they need to feel like they have opportunity. And what we've learned from our work is that trusting relationships contribute to people feeling more capable. So when they're in the work and they feel this sense of trust, they feel more capable of implementing. They also feel more motivated. So when they're in a good relationship with other stakeholders, it motivates them. And finally, when stakeholders are working together, it creates more opportunity, which feeds more trust building. We know that when people start to feel more trust, that they communicate more, they're more likely to coordinate their efforts, and they're more likely to even collaborate, to share resources, to share decision-making. Those types of behaviors result in denser networks. And you might know from research studies that look at like social network analysis, dense networks can be very helpful for implementation. You know, when you have siloed work, you have kind of these spokes coming out when you're trying to measure how connected people are to each other. The more siloed the work is, the less likely it is to reach success or to be sustained. So we know that that trust actually ends up resulting in denser social networks. And the cohesion that people feel from being a part of those networks produces both commitment and resilience in the face of implementation challenges, which are inevitable. So it's a huge protective factor at both an individual level, but also a group and systems level, that then would lead to implementation being more likely to be sustained and continuously improved, and children and families more likely to benefit. So I just wanted to share that kind of upfront, that there are outcomes for this work. So it is worth our time to do this. One thing that we've observed and learned from others in our own studies is that there are basically kind of two types of strategies that we can use to build trust. they're actually equally important. So when we think of trust, we think of relationships. So the first thing we might think about are these relational strategies. But technical strategies, or strategies that might even be thought of as more transactional, are also important for trust building. So you need a bit of both. So relational strategies are strategies that we undertake to build trust through the quality, the mutuality, the reciprocity of the interaction. So the trust is built through the interaction, right? Through that reciprocal interaction you're having with others. Technical strategies are used to build trust, and these strategies are more about demonstrating competency, demonstrating reliability, demonstrating credibility, demonstrating knowledge. Those things do matter. It is important to show up, be reliable, demonstrate that you have some value add to the work, especially if you are, I think, like a researcher or an outside consultant. That is really important to be able to do. But so both of these things really matter. And you'll notice there along the bottom, we talk about kind of the starting point for all of this work is humility and co-creation, because it takes a lot to build trust, and we have to recognize that everyone has something to offer to that process. So I'm going to name some relational strategies and some technical strategies. I'm not going to go through them all, and I picked a couple to highlight as we move through for each of these large kind of areas of relational and technical. But I think we'll have some time at the end, and happy to talk more about them. But the relational strategies that we've identified as trust building strategies are vulnerability, so a comfort with uncertainty and risk. So being okay with making yourself vulnerable to something that feels uncertain in the work, or to saying to someone, I don't know, I don't have the answer, can you help me? Authenticity, this is communication, needs to be credible and honest always. Bidirectional communication is more than just a feedback loop, it's the sense making that has to happen, because there's an affective or emotional component to all communication. Talk about that more in a moment. And then co-learning and empathy-driven exchanges. And I've chosen just to highlight those in a little bit more detail. And you'll see along the bottom, these are quotes that I pulled from the learning report for the program here, just to kind of again show this alignment. So what co-learning is listening for the purpose of mutual understanding. And that's a different type of listening than, a lot of the listening that we often do, where we might just be listening for information. But here we're listening for mutual understanding. And there are ways that you can do co-learning exercises with people. So when we have large stakeholder groups together, we often do activities where people come together and we give them an exercise that they walk through. And the role of the listener is to look for the point of connection, to look for the point of shared value, and they engage on that point. And then we ask the other person who is speaking to take on the listening role. So this idea of intentionally listening for mutual understanding and engaging on that point, those are really helpful exercises, especially when you're kicking off kind of teamwork or working communities. And this exercise allows us to negotiate and build trust for all perspectives, including perspectives that are at risk of being excluded from dialogue because of race, ethnicity, status, or language. Status can mean a lot of different things. So you see along the bottom here, we need to recognize each other's skills and expertise. It will help us do our job better. Families suffer when that doesn't happen. Empathy-driven exchanges. This is also something that we can teach people to do. I'm sure folks here are familiar with like empathy interviews. So one of my favorite things to say in the world is, tell me more. Tell me more about that. It's one of the best things you could possibly say. And we have a show here, Kelly Corrigan in the US on our public broadcasting system has a show literally called Tell Me More. And her books are fantastic. And it is an incredible demonstration of empathy. So there are kind of prompts you can do that you can teach people to enter into spaces with deeper empathy. Effectively attuning to all stakeholders and community partners. I noted that there's an emotional component to our communication. So the idea that we have to affectively attune to what someone's saying, not just hearing what they're saying, but feeling what they're saying. And asking someone, how do you feel about that? Those are really important aspects of empathy-driven exchanges. Demonstrating comfort in the relational context, that flexibility you all talked about, balancing that with role is really important to the work, and recognizing that everyone has an impact on this work and should be involved in decision making. And you'll see along the bottom there's a great quote from the learning report about good partnerships that I think really lifts up this idea of empathy in terms of the effort it requires and the time it takes and the commitment it takes to really understand where someone is coming from. Technical strategies. So these may feel like slightly less interesting because it's the relational work that I think we all embrace so much. But as I noted, these kind of technical or even at times transactional strategies are also needed to build trust. So frequent interactions, I can't say enough about these. It reduces uncertainty in implementation efforts. The more you interact, the less uncertain people feel about what's happening. And, you know, when we go long periods of time without interacting, that space gets filled in with what people think is happening rather than, you know, a really good interaction. I'm going to talk about responsiveness and achievement of quick wins a little bit more deeply. But again, I mentioned the idea of demonstrating experience or expertise. And, you know, I believe families are experts on what they need and their communities need. And so really understanding that everyone comes with some lived experience and expertise to the work. And that helps to trust to allow folks to be able to share that with each other. So responsiveness was one I just wanted to go a little more deeply in. And I think Paul mentioned this at the beginning, and you know, the idea of accountability. And I think it's really closely tied to this idea of responsiveness. So kind of doing what you said you would do in a really timely way is really important for trust building. And the more you are responsive, the more asks that you get. And in other research we've done where we've asked people how they know they're in a trusting relationship, they've said, when other people feel comfortable asking me for help. And that feels like so important. And we know that the more responsive we are, the more asks we get. And that can really help in demonstrating our sensitivity to the needs of others in the work. And it does form trust. And what I noticed in the learning report was this idea of trust building happens, you know, with families. So relationship-based partnership approach, working with the whole family. Families tell us what they need, but also this idea at the grant, the funder and the grant holder level, the idea of kind of trusting that work as well and being responsive to what community partners say they need. So this idea of responsiveness can happen at multiple levels of the work, and the trust building can happen at all of those levels as well. And then finally, the last technical strategy I thought I would highlight is the achievement of quick wins. I'm not sure people talk about this. Was like a methodology that was used in the US, quick wins methodology, about, oh gosh, 10 years ago. I mean, people don't talk about it as much now. But just the idea that you can see in that kind of middle dot point that higher levels of trust impact implementation outcomes. So the more we trust, the better the implementation outcomes. I kind of shared that on an earlier slide about outcomes. But the achievement of implementation outcomes also builds trust. So it's this kind of virtuous cycle. And that's because when people are trusting and they're able to kind of move the work forward, they're more likely to achieve those outcomes. But also achieving those outcomes makes people think, oh, right, like we've got something going on here. We're doing really well together. And that fosters even more trust. So it's really important to intentionally plan for early successes, celebrating those kind of quick wins. That is critical to trust building. And that in turn will continue to foster more implementation success. So I noticed in the report, there was a focus on outcomes focused implementation and kind of understanding what works and what's not working. And I think that that's related to this idea of kind of celebrating those early successes. Just wanted to note how important that is for trust building. So that's it on my end. I hope I didn't go too over, Katie.
No, is the short answer. I think you did. I think you covered a number of really interesting topics. I see a few clapping hands. So no, I think you did very well there, Allison. I always forget when talking to Allison that I need to put on I would say in Ireland you did quite well there, Allison. But actually in American speak, that is, you are fabulous. Okay?
I know. I know, thank you. I know. Yeah, we've got to be super positive, right? Yeah. So
so I'm going to pick out two things before we move to our last but by no means least speaker, Jacinta. Get yourself ready there. You have a moment or two. So I loved a couple of those things. I think it's a really important message that trust leads to better outcomes. So there is evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that where there are trusting relationships, there are better outcomes for children and families, is what we're talking about now. So Allison has given us that slide that builds that case, is really important, I think, for everybody interested in better outcomes to understand. So trust is not just an airy-fairy thing that's nice to have. That's, I think, part of the point there. And then I thought the examples, the way you categorized the strategies to build trust and distinguishing between the relational and the technical strategies, I bet we'll have some discussion about that as we have some time for discussion. So just that's a few reflections. Thank you very much. I am now going to warm up our final input, which is Jacinta, founder and CEO of Bolster Community, a social enterprise providing support services from early years to senior years. Isn't that a fabulous way to say that? I just thought that was beautiful, the way that is said. They are one of the organizations funded through the Reaching Out Supporting Family program. And Jacinta, I'm hoping, is going to share her thoughts on power relationships and implementation from the perspective of a community provider of services. So really looking forward to hear what you have to say, Jacinta. And again, take your time. We're good on time.
You should never say that to me, Katie.
Okay, well, don't worry. I'll give you the 2-minute warning if you need it.
Okay. So, look, absolute privilege to listen to Mel and Allison there talking about, I suppose, some of the experiences and challenges that we've overcome and gone through in the last 7 years. But before I start, I have to say I got a timely notification on my phone there to make sure I do the lottery tonight. And I just wanted to pay homage to the UK National Lottery and our own National Lottery in Northern Ireland, because children can't benefit from services that don't exist. And without the National Lottery, we wouldn't have had this 7-year programme, and nor would the other 35 projects have been able to deliver the change and transformation that they have. So thank you to CES for your support during this absolute journey. And now to talk about trust. And I suppose we have supported over, I think, about 3,200 children over the last week. We were lucky enough to get the extension funding for the additional 2 years to put the evidence into practice. And that's been an amazing kind of experience as well. But 10 minutes, 7 years, 3,200 children, no pressure. So I thought I would try and keep this really simple and focused on the practical, because, you know, like Allison said there, that staying curious has led us to great experience and great relationship building with and between public sector, community and voluntary sector, families, communities, children, schools. So that's been a huge learning for us, staying curious and asking what else might help. So I want to hold that theme as we work through this sort of 10 minutes. So trust is defined as having confidence, faith, or hope in someone or something. But that takes time. Trust takes time. And what the funder did in this project was allowed us time to walk alongside people who need it to build trust and to set out on their own journey. At the core of our supporting families offer was trust. It was like the center of a stick of Brighton rock. Without the kiss me quick hat, we were very keen that trust was the start, middle and end of our family support journey. I'm going to talk to you about a referral that came in from a colleague of us who's a health visitor. And she was used to popping in through our work with the Family Support Hub and keeping the referrals and the referrers appraised of what was new to the area. And she rocked up one day and said, look, I've got a family and I'm in a hurry. They need a leather suite because the child's been recently diagnosed with as asthmatic and she's allergic and we need a suite. So as a practical family support charity, getting a suite, that was no problem. A leather suite, mind you. So we put an ask out. We could have furnished a couple of shops with the amount of offers we got, but we sourced a lovely leather suite, spoke to the family, had it delivered. And whilst helping set it up, our family support workers noticed a few things. They noticed it was tea time in a small housing estate. But there was smell of cooking and the bustle and hustle of tea time in other homes and within that community. There was no smell of cooking in this home. There were 4 children, but there wasn't any chairs at the kitchen table and there were no toys. Now it may be that mum cleaned up because they were common and because the sweets coming in, things were put out of the way. So there was no judging. However, our delivery man said to the family support worker, in a very judgy way, that he noticed the cigarette packs lying in the driveway. He noticed the large 52-inch TV on the wall and sort of tutted that there's just some people can't help themselves. The family support worker said to him, you know, people can always benefit from help, but sometimes you need to listen first and hear what's needed. How right was she? That leather suite became a conduit to transformation and change for that family. The family support worker gave mum a telephone number and said, look, if there's anything else we can help you or dad with, just ask. As the family support workers kind of went home that night, they thought about the loan that paid for that 52-inch TV would probably cost more in the long run than their holidays, you know, summer hot in the summer. They thought about the stress of mum and dad that was evident. And they were delighted when the next day, unannounced, mum, dad and 2 children rocked up at our office on a high street in Uri. Those parents spoke gently of feeling scared, overwhelmed and unsure. They disclosed that they had asked the health visitor for a suite because she knew about the asthma. And they talked to our staff then about the debt they were struggling with, their issues around budgeting, how it was handier to get a takeaway than plan to cook and feed their children. They talked about their own personal health issues. They talked that now they were actually at risk of homelessness because they got into housing arrears. By the time mum, dad and kids left that day, and as Mel says, fueled by copious amounts of tea and a few bickies, there was a sense that we were at the start of something that would prove interesting. That second-hand leather suite tells the story of 2 adults with intellectual learning disability and their 4 children. They became a journey of trust and growth. Due to the depth of the relationship that grew from that ask, our community, our staff, our partners, our stakeholders, each element of that need was resourced and supported over time, but it took trust, risk and care. What became evident then when we spoke to some of our wider stakeholders was that the family had already got access to many professionals. They were already getting help. The GP was aware of the need for antidepressants. The local housing team were doing everything they could to encourage and support mum and dad to budget better. Our schools knew that the children were often hungry, unkempt and struggling with routine. But each was trapped, each professional, each agency was trapped within their own silo of resource issues and caseload cycle. No agency had the time alone to unpick that tangled weave of factors impacting the family. And over the 5 years of walking alongside mum, dad and their 4 children, and through the good fortune of the National Lottery funding and our absolute pride in our local family support hub, which coordinates 14 partners' resources to bring to bear change for people. This family accessed services, courses, they learned budgeting, cooking. They asked for help often, and I was interested to hear that people ask for help more and come forward, which we saw as a really good thing. So over time, home life improved, the children flourished, school classroom assistants, our support workers worked together to manage homework. We bought new uniforms, we clothed, we shoed them when it was required, and milestones were met. The children accessed our out of school summer schemes, but most importantly, the family came together to funded trips, and they had fun together, and they hung out together, and they met other families and other support networks that they were unaware of. Everyone looking down the lens of that family saw the power of trust, of connection, and also the impact of being curious, asking and reaching out for help. I often wonder if that health visitor realised the wheels that she set in motion by looking for the second-hand suite. Now, that's one story of thousands that we've come across. But the one asked to the right person who remains curious created a powerful sequence of trust, connection, and transformation. Allison tells us that when trust exists, individuals are encouraged to engage in the risk-taking that will bring around learned change and implementation efforts. Just on that, another example that comes to mind, which tells of we had a dignitary coming to visit, and it was during COVID times, and so we asked some of our beneficiaries, would one of them prepare a video and to keep it real and authentic and to talk from the heart. And one of our mums appeared on screen with her hair blow dried and her makeup on and looking absolutely pucka, and her kids were exemplary on screen for the duration of the testimonial. Mum was confident and articulate and thrilled to be asked to speak on behalf of this lottery project that she had benefited from. Afterwards, Mum spoke about the confidence she'd gained, about the support her children had, about how they had overcome their disability and engaged in outdoor fun and let off a bit of steam, and how they now had healthy, happy demeanours and attended after school and summer programmes provided by the National Lottery Funded project. When the video was over, some of our visitors commented on Mum's composure and how well behaved her children were. And some of our attending staff and health workers were blown away with Mum's performance, so proud and so absolutely in her corner. But only they knew the full journey. Only they knew that not once in that testimonial did Mum reach back into her troubled past. Not once did she flinch. Not once did she seek reassurance. And yet this mum had overcome domestic violence, trauma, separation. Her daughter carried the life-changing brain injury scars and incontinence caused when Mum's partner propelled the child at a very young age like a rag doll out of the window onto the street below. And some 6-7 years before Mum took the stage to give this testimony, she had witnessed what it's like when the professionals move from crises, when the media scrum dissipates, when reporters aren't interested, and when friends feel the burden of a long journey of support and help. So what was an absolute pleasure for Mum was that she had found access to a trusted range of partners who had walked alongside her, not doing things for her or to her, but with her. And we, through that funding, were able to walk alongside that mum and her daughter. So, it's a pleasure for us to be here. I do feel the weight of the other 35 projects and hope I can do them justice. So, look, that's 2 stories of trust amongst many. These stories show the value of saying, trust me, and let's see what else might help you get through this and get ahead. I read recently from a saying that said, we all need to be someone's security blanket when theirs is in the wash. And I guess that's a good way of describing how we helped that mum who was living very small think a bit bigger. It's been our privilege, and thank you for the time today.
Thank you, Jacinta. I don't know how we'll ever follow that, actually, so I'm very glad we kept your input till the last input. Now I know why, Mel. Thank you. Jacinta, that was super, absolutely super. I know you picked only 2 stories. The leather couch, the leather suite, as you called it, the leather couch, and the mum giving her testimony. What powerful stories that brought to life. Fabulous. You also gave us a fabulous definition of trust, a really short one at the beginning. So I'm just going to remind people what you said. I think I have this right. Trust is about having confidence, faith, or hope in something. And the leather suite and the journey, that family who initially came to you about the leather suite and that opened the door to so many other things. That journey, you said, took trust, risk, and care. Again, I thought those 3 words really resonated with what some of the others have said today. But you've created a really colourful image for me, and I'm sure for others, of what trust can look like and feel like for both the people providing services, the workers, and the families who are lucky enough to sometimes finally receive it, because I know there's some comment in the chat that, you know, not everybody gets there, and so let's leave that for the discussion. But thank you, Jacinta. Super. So we are somehow miraculously right about roughly on time now. And so what I would like to do is, there have been, well, firstly, I'm just going to really quickly thank the 4, I don't want to call you speakers, contributors who contributed today. So maybe we might just show our appreciation whatever way we want for Paul, Mel, I'm going to forget somebody, Allison and Jacinta. I think I have you all. So really well done, folks. Thank you so much. Now, we're going to go to some questions and discussion. I have been keeping a little eye on the chat, and I'm going to pick out a couple of them. Mel, where's Mel? I can't see Mel. Mel, are you still there? Can you help me keep an eye on the chat and the questions, particularly the newer ones coming now in the last few minutes? So I picked out a couple of questions, and what I'm going to ask is, if the people are, somebody called Mary has made a couple of comments in the chat. Susan Brocklesby has a couple of comment in the chat. Eileen Jackman and Michelle Harris. Just to put you on warning, if you're around, I might ask you to put on your mic in a moment. So I'm going to start with Mary. Mary, are you still there? Put on your mic for a moment to tell me you're still there. Oh, you just made a comment. You're bound to be there, Mary.
I am here.
Oh God, Mary, I can't believe it's you, Mary. Right. Okay. Could you pick one question or comment to make?
I can't remember anything.
Okay, I'll tell you. So you can pick, here you go. You can talk about, you commented about the differential, the power differential, and does that work both ways? And how did that work in reaching out, supporting families? And you also spoke about the importance of joy in implementation. Pick one of those and direct it to one of the speakers.
So, of course, I won't pick one of them, Katie. I'm going to talk about both those. The joy bit was in response. Mel actually said it was a joy. Yeah. So my response was, isn't it lovely to hear people talking about the joy of the work? And my comment was, we don't hear enough about that in implementation. It is a joy. It is a joy. So I was really happy, Mel, and thank you for that. The earlier piece was really, I think it was Paul talking about the willingness to call each other out on stuff. So my question is, does that work both ways? Does it work enough both ways? So I think, especially where there's a power differential, and I know, Alison, you were saying the very obvious power differentials are between the funder and the funded, but there are other kinds of power imbalances within relationships as well. And I think, you know, we have to monitor that. It's not, you know, we may be willing to call others out, but do they feel as free? Are there more consequences for them if they call us out on stuff? So I don't, Mel, you like that. I was really interested to know how that worked in reaching out, supporting families.
Well, I think there are sort of two elements to it. The joy for me was just being around these projects, like what they were doing, the quality of what they were doing. I was just so impressed by their commitment to the work, their inventiveness. You know, we have got this awful phrase, that hard to reach. They went above and beyond. They went around and over and under just to make sure that they were really accessible, really easy to work with. And that was a joy to watch, and it was a joy to talk to them, you know, and just to see them getting to the point where they were really able to be honest with each other about what was working and what was not working. But I think that one of the other really good things, when I was thinking about in implementation terms about this program, what the conclusion I came to was that we traditionally think that we do the implementation, that the funder does part of the implementation, and then the service or the project does part of the implementation. Maybe there's an implementation body like ourselves who do part of the implementation. But this program, it was there for you know, a good stretch of time, and it was very intentional about empowering parents. And I would say we got to the point where, honestly, parents were implementation partners. They were benefiting from the program, but they were also part of shaping the program, and they were also part of co-designing and that co-production bit, which is even harder to achieve, of these projects. And like that's pretty amazing, you know, to get to that point. You can really say that that's happening. And like some of these were parents who were very on the margins, absolutely on the margins, not the usual candidates that you might think will make it onto the board or the, you know, the steering committee, but people who were brought right in from the margins and then were champions for the work, and you know, part of the sort of expert advisory group, which was lovely, just lovely to see.
Thanks, Mel. I'm going to invite us, do any of the other contributors want to make a comment on this? I'm looking, though you can't see me, looking at Jacinta or Allison by any chance?
No, I think there was other accountability had. Katie, particularly through our family support hub, where, you know, every month people turn up and eyeball each other, and we look back at what has been achieved and the referrals taken, and there's no accountability, like peer accountability. And I think that was also a very cathartic and strong foundation to our experience.
Great, Jacinta, thanks. Alison?
I just wanted to say, just in implementation work, and thinking, actually coming back to the concept of funders, and I totally agree with what Mary's saying. There are other power dynamics at play all the time, but I'm a huge fan of operationalizing what we mean by engagement and addressing issues of power. And so like the spectrum for engagement, you know, and there's many versions of that, but kind of that, you know, inform, consult, involve, collaborate, you know, co-create, and really trying to articulate and operationally define what is meant by each of those, and what activities would be conducted in order to really move to something that was more collaborative or co-creative. Because I have found that in a lot of this work around kind of building trust and sharing power, that that people say things, but it doesn't actually play out that way. Talking about different projects I've been involved in, and that can have actually more negative effects. It's harder to repair trust, I think, than to build it. And so when we indicate how we're going to approach work and we don't approach it that way, so that's why I think from the very beginning, it's to get really clear about what it means to relinquish authority, to be transparent in decision making. You know, if that's really the goal of an implementation project, I think it's really important to get clear on those values and clear on what that looks like from the very beginning.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks, Mary, for kicking us off. Never shy of a question, Mary. Good woman. Now, Susan Brocklesby, are you there? You had a comment and question, and I think it was around the outcomes. You wanted people to talk about how outcomes-focused program, what difference that makes and what that looks like in reality. Susan, are you there? And would you like to say
yeah.
something? Great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. Sorry, my Wi-Fi is pretty bad, so
Fine,
I'm just
we can hear you perfectly.
Video on or the screenshot on. So it's been a great session. Learned so much, and I feel quite validated by a lot of what everybody's saying. I suppose my question was about outcomes, and that often when you're looking at implementation, there's so much organizational change and all those. I mean, the slide Alison had as well about the fear and the sort of thing when things can go wrong. And how can you introduce outcomes both in terms of your implementation partners and then parents? How can you gather the information and bring people on board without damaging that trusted relationship that's going so well, if that makes any sense, especially with that kind of concern that you're coming in with a clipboard and you want to evidence your work and you're using standardized measures and all this sort of stuff. So I mean, you know, my own sense is about bringing co-design was mentioned, and having people on board in terms of what the value of gathering and the choice of how you're going to measure that. So it's a question really about that. And I know when Melanie was presenting there, she'd mentioned something like social isolation and so on. So it's really just, I know Erin came back and said that that's often, that it was qualitative feedback from interviews and so on. So it was really just that on an ongoing basis, how do you bring your implementation partners on board with that in a non-threatening, in that sort of honouring the trusted relationship piece, and then also obviously our parents and children and families as well, so that it's very, you know, the ripple of relationships carries on by using positive and strengths-based outcomes, as it were, measures.
Thanks, Susan. There's a lot in that, but I will let the contributors pick what they want. And I'm also going to invite Eileen or Nuala from the National Lottery Community Fund, if either of them would like to come in. So who would like, I'm going to look for 2 contributors if possible. Who'd like to say something? Outcomes focused programs and impact of that, relationships. Who'd like to start?
I can give a little bit of introduction, and then Eileen can probably talk more about the indicators, some of the indicators that specifically have been used. Probably you can give a broader picture across the fund, Eileen. In this particular programme, there were 36 projects. They were doing vastly different things. All of them were working with families where there was a child under 12, and they were working to 3 core outcomes. And those 3 core outcomes were that families would be more resilient in the face of adversity, that families, that children and parents would come together to learn, and that families would be a greater part of the community in which they lived. So that whole kind of reducing isolation, bringing people together, was a really strong element in this project from the beginning, in this programme from the beginning. And we did a lot of logic modelling at the beginning for people to really get to grips, because they came in with their own outcomes sitting underneath these outcomes, these 3, which needed to feed in. And so, I mean, if I was honest, I would say there was a great deal of hand wringing, not only about what the indicators might be, but also about how you're going to get them. And particularly where in the real reaching out element of it, so it's called the Reaching Out Supporting Families programme, and the reaching out element where they had the family fun days, dads and sons fishing, Zumba, and at that point they're trying to put as little pressure on parents as possible. You know, you can come in and give your name, and I would say the projects, one of the benefit was the length of time that they had to collect the data, so they could afford the luxury of a little bit of time at the beginning where people had to give very little information about themselves, and then they were just able to count the number of people who came back, you know, and some of those things sort of really sort of short-term indicators of whether people are engaging or not. And then I would say there was a lot of qualitative stuff. So the hope then was that there was a pipeline that people were then able to engage in more structured, you might say, or maybe more formalized activities. And then at that point, the trust was there to start gathering more sort of, I don't know how to, I was going to say sort of more meaningful information, but the fact that somebody who's never come across the door before comes back a second week is actually meaningful in itself. But so there was a lot of thought went into it, and some of it was quite incremental over time, and it was hard. Eileen, you probably have a lot more to add than that.
Well, I think, Melanie, it's interesting that we're talking about trusted relationships, because I think about the trusted relationship between us, thinking about outcomes and indicators and where we've been on that journey with it. And I think you gave a wonderful introduction and a really great overview of the program and in terms of the outcomes and how it worked. This was an outcomes-based program. So as Melanie has highlighted, we had the 3 program outcomes, but we did ask the projects to then have their own project outcomes, which had to link to these overarching ones. And I think, as you've highlighted there, Melanie, the outcomes were very much linked to the different approaches. It's a program of 36 projects, but I think somebody was talking about networks earlier, and there is very much a fascinating social network of this program and actually what was being done and the types of work that was being done and the activities, the approaches, all the way from that broad community development cohort to that real intense immediate support, sort of crisis intervention. You know, that early intervention that's happening, you know, when there has been crisis, but how do we stop further crisis, or how do we ensure that this doesn't escalate into a bigger situation? And so I think across the board there was different approaches to indicators within those projects. And I think even sometimes projects had to think outside the box a little bit. So maybe indicators more about actually, you know, well, you know, how many people are accessing our website, you know, and what does that mean, and what does that tell us, and what does that enable? And I think as well, certainly within the program, the outcomes, but being flexible about them as well, you know, and understanding that actually this was a big program with big ambitions, thinking about, Allison, you were talking about systems change, and that would definitely be something that was in our minds when we were developing this program. It was family support, thinking about how do you improve early years? How do you support children under the age of 12? And the way to do that is by recognizing they sit within a family, they sit within a community, they sit within a wider network, and actually that it's working with that whole unit is how you actually achieve these things. So very much test and learn, you know, is certainly something, and something that we at the fund would invest a lot in, you know, and we appreciate that. And that there was some conversation about taking risk earlier, you know, and I think that's something that we just naturally embrace and approach. And again, that flexibility and the role of trust that comes in there, as well as, you know, as a funder, you know, our expertise lies with the grant making, you know, and the process by which that happens. The expertise of people like Jacinta and the other 35 projects, you know, on the ground, that family support day in, day out, like yourselves at CES, your expertise that you brought in, and even the learning so much about implementation myself, and that just being flexible and recognizing that things can and do change. And I think to kind of circle back to some of the things that Mary was talking about earlier, I think that is quite integral to how you think about power dynamics. That would be my perspective, you know, working as a funder, that it's working with groups, working alongside them, recognizing that things are going to have to change and adapt, and that life happens and we need to be flexible, and there's always going to be things that are going to impact on project delivery, and how can we help make that a bit easier for people, and even particularly during the pandemic, the importance of actually being proactive and not forcing groups to come to us and say, look, we're dealing with this struggle, us actually picking up the phone and going, we know that things are tough, we know that things are challenging, what do you need from us? So certainly a journey on this program where we are with, you know, and where we are as an organization with outcomes. And I think that we would think beyond outcomes. We certainly value them. We certainly see the importance of them. But we do think about, you know, evidence and learning and the different ways that can be collected and what that might look like. So we've certainly been on a journey with it ourselves.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Mel. And I'm going to add in on that one for anybody interested, that we in CES have used the Reaching Out Supporting Families program as an example to some of the state funders in Ireland of a really good example of outcomes-based program, and the flexibility that an outcomes-based approach to funding can bring, adapting to local service needs, all those things that you almost take for granted. I know you don't, you appreciate it on the Reaching Out Supporting Families, but actually it is somebody, Susan said in her comment, it's a real it's a change of mindset and culture, and I think we're on a journey, a lot of state funders on that front. So hold your reaching out, supporting families up as a really nice example. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it definitely has gone a lot, you know, it's gone a good way of the journey there from what I can see. So well done. Now, is Michelle Harris still with us? Michelle, you had a really cryptic small point. No, she's gone. Okay. Mel is saying no. She had a really, I thought that was a lovely comment about the question about why won't we do something or offer something is a really good question. So just, I just wanted to pull that out. Okay, Mel, have we any other questions? R&D in the chat, or does anybody else have a comment or a thought from the participants or from the contributors?
Yes, we have a comment from Tom Jefford. This is a really interesting point, Tom. Worth remembering that in Rogers' diffusion of innovations curve, that the innovators who are at the start of the curve are the least trusted group as they are proposing the new and countercultural, whilst the early adopters are most recognized as the most trusted and whose advice is sought by the early and late majority. It's very, very interesting. And Tom's still with us.
He is. I'm looking at him. Tom, anything to add?
I guess it's a question about who is trusted in systems and where you seek advice. You know, so if you're thinking about a project, who do you go and talk to? Do you talk to the person that's developed the evidence-based intervention, or do you go and find the person that implemented it first or implemented it second to get the inside gen on? You know, so tell me, give me the truth. Where is the truth? And I think those things are really important, because we want honesty, but we also want to build trust and find ways in which we can use trust to our advantage. And I guess a reflection on what Alison and the rest of the speakers have been saying is that you might have groups who trust each other in very hostile systems. So you might have a small group of people who work incredibly well together, but actually really set themselves against what is a very pernicious or hostile environment, or an environment that's subject to lots of rapid change. I'm thinking about partnerships I've been involved with where we've had police officers who tend to change their role very quickly. They get reassigned, you know, so they're doing domestic violence one day and then they're out on reactive policing, you know, that's their new assignment, and they'll almost stop at the end of 1 week and then start their new assignment the next. Is you have to rebuild that so quickly. So how do you induct people into new trusted relationships? Because turnover in partnerships is one of the biggest risks to partnerships too. And assuming that your partners are all going to be there and static for the duration of your project is probably a bit of a fool's errand, because people will change. So you then have to think about, well, how are you going to tell people about the journey this partnership's been on and the trust that's been engendered, to then replace that with the new entrants that come along?
Okay, so that was a comment and a question. So that's how do you build and maintain trust in when there's turnover in staff and people in roles? Anybody want to comment on that from our contributors?
I'm just thinking about the reality is we've been very blessed to have a consistent staff team, and I guess we're dealing with people with often, you know, kind of matters that are really pressing for them, and you help them get through and get by, and they come back again at a later stage, and they're usually so much in need that if they trust the that portal that they go through, the ask is about getting them to the next stage. And if the personnel has changed, so be it, but the consistency is around authenticity and reflection and being alongside them for the next piece.
Alison, you're about to depart. So I was going to ask you actually did you have any final comment? Now is your moment.
Oh, for me, I really loved what Tom was saying. It's nice to see you, Tom. I think it's been a long time. But I had these like two thoughts. One, when you were noting about the early adopters, one of the things that is hard in, and I don't know if this is a uniquely US piece, but you guys can let me know, especially in certain large metropolitan areas where you might have really large kind of service providers, they're often thought of as being on the inside. And the smaller service providers that are maybe serving certain subpopulations, whether those are refugees or immigrants, like in specific communities, maybe don't have as many resources to innovate or to try on new things. And so sometimes you kind of see that the partnership set up, inherently there is a bit of a lack of trust of people feeling like kind of insiders or outsiders to work. And then the other piece is that just working a lot in service systems where there's a strong compliance and blame culture, there is not a sense of psychological safety in those environments at all. And that is for families don't feel safe, people delivering services don't feel safe. I'm talking psychologically safe as well as at times physically safe in some areas, but the idea that, but leaders don't feel safe, because there is a blame culture and there is a quick with media, and there's a lot of turnover and a lot of politics involved. And I have found that to just be an enormous struggle with not only the turnover rates, but just the way that the systems are set up, which are to focus on blame rather than learning. And that trickles down to what families experience, and the lack of sense of psychological safety in these systems is something that is, I think, misunderstood and not assessed in implementation. And our effort should really be to build a culture of safety as part of our foundational implementation work. And there is a lot of literature on how to do that as well. But it's interesting how disconnected that is from implementation work.
Thanks, Alison. Oh, sorry, Mel.
Sorry.
So, Mel, I have one suggestion. Is Pauline Spence from MenCap still here? She had a question for Alison, seeing as we have Alison. And then we might move to the video, folks. So I'm going to do the Pauline question, Alison response, and then I'm going to hand over to video and Magella. Okay. Pauline, where are you? Speak now, Pauline.
Yeah, here.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, it was just I was just asking Alison, was interested in they'd said about using Outcome Star, and I suppose we've kind of had a few mixed results with it, and I think it's that kind of, well, if you introduce it too early, then people aren't ready for it and they don't feel trust in it, and possibly then that knocks the staff's confidence and, you know, those kind of things. So I was just interested in their experience of it.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with the outcomes.
So, no, sorry, it was Allison from Bolster, actually.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Jacinta from Bolster. Okay, we've got confused. Jacinta, you're up now. You're off the hook, Alison. Jacinta, you're on.
This is even more comical than it sounds. Alison Slater, who's my colleague, who's sitting in the other room, put up that comment and this is her rightful place. She should have been here today. She bounced the ball to me. She's the Outcome Star queen. Can I suggest, Pauline, that we hook up afterwards, because there's a really interesting journey that we went on around Outcome Stars, and it's been powerful. So Alison and you and I maybe can have a chat after this.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. Actually, and Alison has come back to me to sort of respond a wee bit in a kind of private message. So
fabulous.
Just that has been helpful.
Okay, sorry, that was me being confused between the Alisons. I apologise on that. Now, have we time? There was a Nikki comment. Could we do that really quickly? Nikki.
Hi.
Hi, Nikki, go first.
No, I just, it was on the point that someone had said about, sorry, I'll turn my camera on again. It was about what to do when staff change. And we've actually had quite a number of staff changes throughout the programme, with maternity leave, including myself. One of the social workers, we're in the Step Up, Step Down project. So it's the fostering network in partnership with Southeastern Trust. We had our project worker who started at the outset of the project. She changed. So I suppose what we've developed throughout time has been a real trauma-informed way of working, a real non-judgmental, inclusive way of working with families. And I think that has helped anyone new that's come into the project. We have been able to work alongside them, bring them up to speed with how we work, so that it's not just about catching up, where are we at with the project. It's more important that we have a particular way of working and that families get that consistency through there, if that makes sense.
Very good. Brilliant. Thank you, Nikki, for that. Majella, I'm going to hand over to you.
So I think the first thing we're going to do is just see our final video. Katrina?
The first one or the second one?
The second one, I think. If that's okay.
Reflecting on why relationships matter, families illustrated that relationships create the conditions for change to take place.
So I did have support for 10 weeks with a counsellor, and he was just unbelievable. He was so supportive, so kind, so empathetic. Like, right away I felt really comfortable with him, and he really drilled down into the nitty-gritty of the problems that I was having or feelings that I was having.
She was a really nice, genuine, kind person when we really needed kindness.
And you know what? He just made me kind of face it in a way. He sent me challenges and stuff every week, and things that I would normally say, well, all right, that'll do, no problem, okay, talk to you later, and I would never do, but he always followed up on it. You know, from the start I was thinking, this is a torture, but you see, he knew exactly what he was doing, because you see, then I looked forward to our weekly sessions, and I looked forward to it because I could feel it. I could feel a change in myself. But you know what? I could feel the change in the atmosphere in the house as well. It was the way they approached things as well. You never felt judged.
Trusted relationships build confidence to change.
My son grew very fond of a project worker, and even when we came to do the family matters and stuff, and there was activities, he sort of stuck beside the project worker because he was familiar with him. Sometimes he'd come home from school and he'd say to me, he helped me do a wee checklist. I think it was more a wee confidence boost for my son. It really, really helped with his confidence.
They kind of gave me the confidence to start getting out there and making changes and doing things.
The difference in my son is night and day, and it was all the support that he's received in the past couple of years. A massive change.
Building relationships creates a sense of being part of something bigger.
It's opened up our horizons to so much more opportunities to meet amazing families, to meet people who want to help, to chat to people who've been in similar situations to us, and just to get out there and enjoy family days. It took away that feeling of being alone, realising other people were going through the same thing.
For me, it's good to get out and speak to other people, because then I think I'm not on my own, and that's that feeling of being part of something, and you're not the only person who's going through depression or has difficulties or struggling with behaviour, and it's actually good sometimes to have a chat with somebody else.
So can I just draw today's event to a close, and in doing so, can I first of all thank Paul, as well as his colleagues Eileen, Nuala and Kate at the National Lottery for their partnership over the last 7 years. Can I thank Katie for very expertly chairing this afternoon's event for us, and for all her expertise and support on implementation over the last number of years with this project. Mel as our project lead in the CES team, joined by Katrina, Claire, Erin, Dervla, Jen and Alison in preparing for today. But I particularly want to thank Allison Metz, who has walked this journey with us over the last number of years in building our capacity and sharing her insights, and Jacinta, reflecting not just Bolster, but all the grant holders that we've had the privilege to work with over the last 7 years. There's been, although this has been an online event, it's been quite, there's been quite a almost emotional dynamic, I think, amongst the speakers this afternoon, and also a joyful dynamic, reflecting, I think, the strong relationships across the programme. So thank you very much, everyone. The video will be shared, and there's a lot of resources that have been put into the chat today that I hope you take the opportunity to access. Do come back to us. We're interested to share and work with you on implementation. So do come back to us, and we'd love to have a conversation with you. So thank you very much, everyone. All the best. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody.